When we begin speaking about the historical journey of the compilation of the Quran, we cannot start after the death of the Prophet FDFA. We have to begin at the very moment revelation itself descended upon the heart of Prophet Muhammad. Because the preservation of the Quran was not an afterthought in Islamic history, it was part of the revelation from the very beginning. This is what makes the Quran unique among all religious scriptures. The process of preservation began the same day the verses were revealed. For 23 years, the Quran came down gradually. Sometimes verses were revealed in moments of crisis. Sometimes after questions were asked, sometimes during war, loss, victory, family disputes, or spiritual struggle. The Quran was not revealed as a disconnected manuscript dropped from the heavens. It entered real human life. It shaped a civilization while that civilization was being formed, and this gradual revelation created a deep emotional and psychological attachment between the believers and the words of Allah. The Prophet FDFA would immediately memorize every revelation sent to him, but beyond his own memorization, he established an entire culture centered around preservation. Arabia at that time was primarily an oral society. People memorized poetry that stretched hundreds of lines. Genealogies were preserved entirely in memory. Language itself was an art form among the Arabs. So when the Quran was revealed, it entered a society already trained to preserve speech with extraordinary precision. But the Quran was not left to memory alone. This is a very important point. The Prophet FDFA appointed official scribes of revelation. Among them was Zayd ibn Thabit, along with other companions who would write the verses immediately after revelation descended. The Prophet FDFA would dictate the verses carefully, and he would even specify where each verse belonged within a chapter. Think about what this means. The arrangement of the Quran was not random, nor was it a later human decision. It was guided under prophetic supervision. The verses were written on parchment, leather, bones, palm stalks, and flat stones, whatever material was available at the time. Yet even with written records, the strongest preservation remained in the hearts of people. Hundreds of companions memorized the Quran directly from the Prophet FDFA himself. They recited it daily in prayer, taught it to their families, and revised it constantly. The Quran was not merely read, it was lived, spoken, heard, and internalized. And psychologically, this matters deeply. Human beings protect what they love. The companions did not preserve the Quran because they were historians documenting literature. They preserved it because they believed these were the literal words of Allah. Every verse transformed them emotionally, spiritually, and morally. The Quran comforted them in grief, disciplined them in moments of weakness, and gave them purpose in a chaotic world. Preservation was therefore not only intellectual, it was devotional. There is also something profoundly philosophical here. Most civilizations preserve information through institutions. The Quran was preserved first through human beings themselves. The message became embedded within living hearts before it became bound within pages. And perhaps this teaches us something powerful about truth itself. Truth survives most strongly when it lives inside people, not merely inside libraries. The Prophet FDFA would revise the Quran every Ramadan with the angel Jibril, and in the final year of his life, this revision occurred twice. Scholars throughout Islamic history understood this as a sign that the revelation had reached completion and finalization. So by the time the Prophet FDFA passed away, the Quran already existed in two powerful forms, memorized collectively by the companions and written across numerous authenticated materials under prophetic supervision. This foundation would become critical in the next stage of Islamic history, when the Muslim community faced one of its greatest fears, the possibility that those who carried the Quran in their hearts might leave this world. And it was at that moment that the companions realized preserving the Quran was not simply a responsibility for one generation. It was a trust for all generations to come. The Quran was never preserved by accident. It was preserved by love, sacrifice, discipline, and divine will, and that should force every one of us to ask, if they dedicated their lives to protecting the Quran, what is our relationship with it today? After the passing of Prophet Muhammad, the Muslim community entered one of the most emotionally fragile moments in its history. Imagine the psychological state of the companions. For more than 2 decades, revelation had descended among them. Whenever confusion emerged, the prophet letter DFA was there. Whenever disputes arose, revelation clarified them. The Qur'an was not distant from their reality. It was actively shaping their lives in real time. And suddenly, the messenger of Allah letter DFA was no longer with them. Yet even in the midst of grief, the companions understood something critical. The mission had to continue. Islam was no longer confined to Medina. The message was spreading rapidly across Arabia, and with that expansion came new challenges. One of the greatest challenges emerged during the Battle of Yamama, fought against the false prophet Musaylima. In that battle, a large number of the Huf, as the memorizers of the Quran, were martyred. This moment shook the Muslim leadership deeply. Not because they doubted the preservation of the Quran, but because they understood the responsibility of safeguarding it for future generations. Umar ibn al-Khattab recognized the seriousness of the situation almost immediately. He approached Abu Bakr with a proposal. The Quran should be compiled into a single manuscript. Now pause and appreciate the significance of this conversation. Abu Bakr initially hesitated, and his hesitation reveals something profound about the companions. He said, in essence, how can I do something the Prophet letter DFA himself did not do? This was not resistance to preservation. It was caution rooted in sincerity. The companions were extremely careful not to introduce anything into the religion that lacked prophetic precedent. Their caution itself became part of the preservation process. But Umar continued explaining the urgency of the matter until Abu Bakr became convinced that this was not an innovation against the religion, it was a service to the religion. This distinction is extremely important. Preservation sometimes requires action that responds to changing circumstances while remaining faithful to original principles. And this balance between loyalty to tradition and practical wisdom is one of the defining strengths of early Islamic leadership. Abu Bakr then assigned the monumental task to Zayd ibn Thabit, and again Zayd initially hesitated. He later said that if he had been asked to move a mountain, it would not have felt heavier than compiling the Quran. Why? Because he understood the magnitude of the trust. This was not the compilation of ordinary literature. This was the preservation of divine revelation. The methodology they used is what truly demonstrates the intellectual rigor of the companions. Zayd did not rely solely on memory, even though he himself was a Hafiz and had served as one of the main scribes of revelation. Instead, every verse had to meet strict verification standards. Written materials were collected from companions and oral memorization was cross-checked carefully. Multiple layers of authentication were used to ensure absolute precision. Think about the philosophical depth of this process. Modern people often assume ancient societies preserved information carelessly, but the compilation of the Quran challenges that assumption completely. What we see here is an extraordinary system of communal verification. Preservation was not dependent on one individual. It was protected by an entire community whose lives revolved around the Quran. And perhaps there is another lesson hidden beneath the history itself. Crisis often reveals what a civilization truly values. When the Muslim community faced political instability, warfare, and uncertainty, their immediate concern was not wealth, expansion, or power. Their concern was the protection of revelation. That tells you everything about the spiritual priorities of the first generation of Muslims. The compiled manuscript remained with Abu Bakr, then after his passing with Umar, and later with Umar's daughter, Hafsa bint Umar. This compilation became the foundational reference for the next stage in the preservation of the Quran, a stage that would address the challenges emerging from Islam's rapid expansion across different regions and languages. What began as revelation in the cave of Hira was now becoming a carefully preserved legacy for humanity itself. And perhaps that should make us reflect on something uncomfortable but necessary. The companions feared losing even a single verse of the Quran, while today many Muslims can go days without even opening it. As Islam continued to spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslim world entered an entirely new reality. Within only a few decades after the death of Prophet Muhammad, Islam had reached regions far beyond Mecca and Medina. New Muslims were entering the faith from Persia, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and other lands. Different cultures, languages, and accents were now united under one religion. And while this expansion was a sign of Islam's strength, it also introduced a challenge the earlier generation had never faced on this scale. The Qur'an had been revealed in multiple accepted dialectical modes to make recitation easier for different Arab tribes. During the lifetime of the Prophet DFA, this diversity was understood naturally because the companions learned directly from him. But as Islam spread into non-Arab societies, people began hearing different recitations without understanding why those differences existed. In some cases, Muslims started arguing with one another, each group believing their mode of recitation was more correct than the other. One of the companions who witnessed this growing tension was Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman. During military campaigns in regions like Armenia and Azerbaijan, he observed disputes among Muslim soldiers regarding Quranic recitation. What disturbed him was not merely disagreement itself, it was the fear that the Muslim Ummah might eventually divide over the Quran in the same way earlier religious communities divided over their scriptures. So Hudhayfa traveled to Uthman ibn Affan and urged immediate action, and once again we see the extraordinary foresight of the companions. Uthman understood that preservation was not only about protecting the words of the Quran from loss. It was also about protecting the unity of the Muslim community around those words. Uthman requested the original compilation that had been preserved with Hafsa bint Umar. Using that authenticated manuscript as the master reference, he appointed a committee led once again by Zayd ibn Thabit, along with other highly knowledgeable companions from Quraysh. Their task was not to create a new Quran. This is a crucial point often misunderstood. Their task was to standardize the written copies according to the dialect of Quraysh, the dialect in which the Quran was primarily revealed, while preserving the authentic recitations taught by the Prophet DFA. The committee prepared several official manuscripts with extraordinary precision. These copies were then distributed to the major centers of the Muslim world, places like Kufa, Basra, Damascus, and Mecca. Qualified reciters were also sent alongside these manuscripts to teach the correct pronunciation and recitation. This demonstrates something remarkable. The Quran was never preserved merely as text. It was preserved through a living oral tradition connected directly from teacher to student. And philosophically, this is deeply important. Written words alone can sometimes become vulnerable to interpretation, detached from original sound and meaning. But the Quran was preserved both visually and orally. The page and the voice worked together. This dual preservation created a system unlike anything else in religious history. Uthman also instructed that unofficial personal manuscripts containing individual notes or incomplete arrangements should not continue circulating publicly if they could create confusion among Muslims. Again, this was not the destruction of revelation. It was the protection of clarity and unity. In modern terms, we might say Uthman was preventing informational fragmentation before it could evolve into theological division. And here we encounter a profound psychological lesson about leadership. Great leaders are not those who react emotionally to crises. Great leaders are those who anticipate future dangers before those dangers fully emerge. Uthman understood that even small disagreements, if ignored, could grow into generational conflict. So he acted decisively, not to control the Quran, but to preserve its authenticity for all humanity. Today, when a Muslim recites the Quran in Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria, Indonesia, or America, the essential text remains the same. Across continents, languages, and centuries, the Quran has remained astonishingly unified. And this unity traces back to the vision and sacrifice of those early companions who understood the weight of their responsibility. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the companions were not only preserving words, they were preserving guidance, identity, and truth itself. And in an age where people are overwhelmed by confusion, noise, and endless competing voices, maybe the real question is not whether the Quran has been preserved. The real question is whether we still allow the Quran to preserve us. When we look back at the entire historical journey of the compilation of the Quran, what becomes clear is that this was never simply a story about manuscripts, ink, or pages. It was a story about divine preservation unfolding through human effort, and this balance is important to understand. Allah could have preserved the Quran in any way He willed. Yet He chose to preserve it through people, through hearts that memorized it, hands that wrote it, minds that verified it, and generations that dedicated their lives to carrying it forward. This is why the history of the Quran is so emotionally powerful. Every stage we discussed reveals an extraordinary level of sincerity and sacrifice. During the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad, revelation was preserved immediately through memorization and writing. Under Abu Bakr, the Quran was compiled into a unified manuscript after the fear of losing memorizers in battle. Under Uthman ibn Affan, standardized copies were distributed to protect the unity of the Muslim Ummah. At every stage, the companions understood that they were carrying something greater than themselves. And perhaps this is what separates the Quran from every other text in human history. The Quran was not preserved by isolated scholars centuries later attempting to reconstruct lost originals. It was preserved publicly, collectively, and continuously from the very moment it was revealed. Thousands memorized it. Communities recited it daily, children learned it from parents, teachers transmitted it to students. Entire civilizations were built around its preservation. Even today, this chain continues. A child memorizing the Quran in a small village today is participating in a tradition that stretches back more than 14 centuries. Think about the psychological beauty of that reality. In a world where almost everything changes, languages evolve, empires collapse, ideologies disappear, the Quran remains remarkably